We're so pleased to be joined today with Senator Cory Booker. Thank you, Senator, for taking the time to be here.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
I want to start today's conversation with an issue you've been working on a lot lately, which is police reform. Your bill was well received by Democrats, but there's been some setbacks in recent weeks. What do you see as the outlook for police reform in the Congress?
Well, the bill has been well received by Democrats and Republicans in the general electorate, in the sense that the pillars of the bill are things Republicans support: banning no-knock warrants that led to the killing of Breonna Taylor, banning carotid and chokeholds that led to the killing of Eric Garner. These are things that are widely supported in the American public. And our bill really is just focusing on things that will save lives, expand accountability, and frankly, bring transparency to American policing. And so I'm confident that this is going to get done. I just want to make sure it gets done in time, that we don't have to see more cycles of police violence that are captured on videotape and that penetrate every corner of our country. But the reality is I have hope, because I think America, from the people that were involved in policing that Obama brought in, had big city police chiefs sitting down with Black Lives Matter to come up with a lot of suggestions to make us all safer and policing better, frankly, to make it more just. And we just haven't seen the action. So this has to get done. It will get done. It's a matter of not if, but when.
Well, today's conversation is focused in large part on the intersection between social, environmental, and economic justice. And I want to go back or refer back to a comment you made on the campaign trail last year, which is that climate is the lens through which we must do everything.
And I stood up in national leadership, joining with other mayors, to say climate change is not a separate issue. It must be the issue and the lens with which we view every issue.
I'd like you to put that climate lens on, looking at this current moment, particularly with COVID-19, which is an issue where the science is not necessarily always being followed. Put that lens on it. And what does it tell you? What does the climate lens tell you in this particular moment?
Well, I also said very directly that environmental justice has to be a part of this idea of climate justice. They're inseparable. And when I really became an environmentalist when I moved to the city of Newark, and it wasn't because of concerns about polar ice caps or the polar bear. Obviously, we concerned about those things, but with the immediacy of the well-being, safety, and security of people that lived in my community. And we still live in a nation where so many Americans are suffering with environmental injustice, but the biggest determining factor of whether you live around toxicity, whether you drink dirty water, breathe dirty air, is the color of your skin. And so there are communities I've visited all around this country, from rural communities to urban communities, where people of color live in conditions that are an everyday assault on their bodies, on their children's brains, on their well-being. And this is one of the factors that leads to this incredible healthcare disparities in outcomes between blacks and whites in this country, is because of the deep toxicity in America. Most people don't realize that there's over 3,000 jurisdictions where children have more than twice the blood lead levels of Flint, Michigan. And again, overwhelmingly, those are people of color. And so this idea that these issues are separable, that you can separate them out and not deal with the totality of the types of injustices that many communities face, is wrong. And frankly, we are seeing, if you're talking about the assaults on black bodies, it's not just disproportionately likely to be killed by the police, but you're seeing assaults on black bodies that come in the form of our environment and come in the form of environmental injustice. And what outrages me, frankly, is how comfortable this country has become with the fact that we have so many children drinking lead water, that we still have Superfund sites. That the number of Superfund sites, these highly toxic sites, used to be going down in America. Now, because of sort of this era of no new taxes, we've refused to reauthorize a tax on the most polluting companies that Ronald Reagan reauthorized, that Mitch McConnell voted for in the past. But now nobody wants to reinstitute, or Republicans are refusing to reinstitute. And therefore, even the funds that we have to clean up these toxic sites are going away. And again, color of your skin, whether you live around toxic sites, if you're Princeton data, if you're born around a Superfund sites, you have significantly higher rates of autism, significantly higher rates of birth defects. I could go on, but we are all involved in these systems of injustice that have to be put to an end.
Yeah, I mean, a great point. And I'm curious, how do you convey that to people who, as you said, might hear, climate, environment, and think about polar bears? How do you make that case?
Well, I think that the environmental movement has to become a lot more diverse than it is, has to be a lot more inclusive of these issues. I don't see a pathway to climate justice, to dealing with climate change, that doesn't have a more inclusive sense of urgency to deal with the right now elements of environmental injustice. So I just am one of those folks that wants to get people be more aware. This has been a period of American history, this short few months, where it seems like our circles of empathy are starting to grow. It seems like we're starting to become more aware, not just our present, but our history as well. Well, the environmental desolation that's so baked into so many aspects of our society. We just started learning a little bit more from this crisis about meatpacking, for example. Well, we have gone back to the days of the jungle and of Upton Sinclair's book, where the conditions under which people are working are so horrific. But we now know that these are part of a larger food systems that are creating massive contributions to climate change. The global corporate multinational meat industries that are perverting the way we've done farming in America. I mean, you don't have the kind of pastoral range crops and meat here in the country. You now have these massive CAFOs that pollute land, pollute rivers, that cause toxic communities where you see respiratory diseases so much higher. You have the treatment of workers are horrible. Animals are horrible. And again, the clearing of our rainforests for more grazing or growing of crops for feeding animals for these multinational corporations. Even in our meatpacking problems where COVID was spreading, the lie that was told that this was for American consumption when it was going overseas to China. These are just deeply broken systems that I've been in Congress really fighting, not just for awareness, but for us to make changes that's going to help for labor issues and worker justice. It's going to help for environmental justice and the health of people. It's going to help on animal issues. It's going to help farmers, frankly, and independent family farmers who are trying to compete against these multinational corporations that are driving them out of business. It's going to help on economic justice for what we're seeing, the monopolistic power that these companies are evidencing. So all of these issues are wrapped up, and we need to start understanding that often unconsciously we're participating in systems of deep injustice. And I can give you just one example, going down to Duplin County, North Carolina, where I just never had seen anything like this, but I'm hearing more and more about the CAFOs, pig CAFOs in those low-lying areas. And I just never had seen massive lagoons of pig waste being sprayed onto fields and watching them in mist off of those properties into residential areas, and meeting with this Black community and community leaders and just hearing their stories about not being able to breathe their air, not being able to run their air conditioning, not being able to open their windows or put clothing on the line, the property values being devastated, having illnesses and sicknesses, all because of this broken system that's creating this. This was a Smithfield, a company that was, if I remember correctly, that is an internationally owned company. And so these are the kind of things that we often participate with our consumer dollars that are causing so much harm and injustice immediately right now to families and homes and communities, but also in the larger context of environmental change. We cannot solve the environmental problem if we don't solve the way we are farming, the way we're doing animal agriculture. And there's a way to get out of this that actually empowers independent family farmers to lead, to take on better practices. But when you look at the policies, not only are we participating with our dollars, but coming out of Washington, these massive ag bills that are so slanted towards these multinational corporations, so slanted towards practices that are harming our environment and not creating a sustainable future. These are all the things that are rolled up into these systems that we have to become more conscious of and more active in fighting against.
Right. Well, America right now, the U.S. is going through a awakening of sorts to systemic racism, to a lot of issues that a lot of us have known about for some time, but many others were unaware of, and it's created opportunities for changes. Do you see an opportunity, an opening for climate and, particularly for environmental justice, like you might see for policing?
Yeah, look, I think that we have suffered long enough from a poverty of empathy in this country, a poverty of love. And I believe in the deep inherent goodness of people. And I think the soul of our country, the heart of our people is this yearning to live up to the values of our founders. In fact, every great social movement, if you listen to Susan B. Anthony, she was quoting our founding documents. Martin Luther King talked about the check that passed due. They're calling to the larger ideals of the soul of our country. And so as empathy grows, as a desire to know our history, to confront our history, this is a reckoning in many ways and creates a better environment for significant change. And so I'm hopeful. I'm a prisoner of hope in a sense, but I'm also not waiting. I think that we need more activists that are pushing the conversation, challenging those of us who've grown comfortable, calling eloquently or artfully to the moral imagination of a country to see itself as it could be, and then demand that we get there. So I can't tell you what's going to happen. I just know that we all have a lot more work to do, and we need to become a lot more urgent, and it's not going to be easy. The conversations are going to be difficult. But if we are to really grow in love, meaning that our policies reflect that value, this is definitely a moment, I'm hoping, as elections come up, where America can turn a corner and start moving in a really great direction.
I'm curious about, you mentioned, we've talked, of course, a lot about environmental justice. You've also introduced legislation related to agriculture and climate, nature-based solutions, that is. I'm curious if you could speak a bit about the need for coalition building, to bring in agriculture to the conversation, along with environmental justice and so many other groups, to build a coalition for climate, really. And could you speak to that? Why you take that approach to legislating?
Yeah, I think that there's a power that forces have in this country when they divide us from having a sense of common cause and common purpose. And I think that this country, and literally there are corporate incentives. I remember a friend of mine, Van Jones, had a show with Newt Gingrich called Crossfire. And they actually sitting down with each other. Brene Brown says it's hard to hate up close, so pull people in. And so here they are sitting down with each other. They realize they agree on a lot, and they decide to do the final segment called Ceasefire. And the producers stopped them from doing it because ratings were going down. There is a lot of profit to be made out of making us hate each other or outraged against each other. I know this from reading classified documents, that the Russians love it when we're at each other's throats, and are using our social media platforms to try to whip up dissent and disagreement and even more hate. And so I just have learned that when we begin to vilify each other and demonize each other and erase the dignity of each other just because we vote differently or think differently, we lose an opportunity to create those constructive coalitions that actually move us forward. And I went on a trip, I think in 2017, if I have it right, just to go out west and in the Midwest and ask to meet with Republican farmers. And I still remember one of them was didn't even seem happy about having me in his house because I was a Democratic senator. But when we actually sat down and started talking the actual issue, we had wide agreement about the monopolies, the sort of corporate concentration that's going on, not only in the agriculture industry, but across our country. But to them, it was really hurting them. Independent family farmers are being driven out of business at rates that are astonishing in America right now. People who've been on their land over a century are losing it because of these big multinational corporations are skewing systems. They're vertically integrated. So they're now, one of the farmers was telling me he used to have 4 or 5 people competing to buy his cattle. And now he's only got one that's dictating to him the price in violation of some of our more famous agri laws, like the Packards and Stockyard Act, which was put into place to stop this kind of consolidation within that industry. And so here's a group that we could be in coalition with I think they are just as invested in fixing our food systems as I am sitting here in Newark with at my bodega. When my kids go to get something to eat, they pay more for a tomato or an apple than they do for a Twinkie product because of us over subsidizing 4 monocrops, so much of which go to feed big corporate animal industry or feed the sugar that then we have to pay for again with the large diabetes rates. There are people all across from different political party affiliation that share a common cause in fixing this broken food system. And I'm one of these people that's working very hard to try to stop very big forces that get billions of dollars through our ag bills, through this broken system, through feeding sickness in America, through having food deserts in America, and really change that so that we have a healthier system that elevates workers and farmers and Americans to have access to healthy food, nurturing food, and it gives resources that are aligned with our priorities. These big ag bills are spending billions of dollars not aligned with our priorities. We should be funding independent family farmers to do cover crops and do all the kind of things that actually can pull carbon out of the air and deal with the climate change, which I think we're not going to be able to solve this problem unless we start getting farmers to lead on that with new sustainable practices. So all of this is wrapped up, but your point is so taken. The old African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Well, we have a long way to go in this country, and we're not going to get there unless we create new coalitions and find ways, frankly, to put more indivisible into this one nation under God.
You've alluded to this throughout the conversation, but I'm curious to hear a bit more about how your time as the mayor of Newark informed your view of environmental justice. I mean, obviously there are lots of issues there, as there are in many cities, but what's your...
I owe so much of who I am to this incredible city. And, I moved into the neighborhood I'm in 20 years ago, which is, we don't mistake wealth with worth. This is one of the richest communities I've ever lived in, even though according to the last census, the median income is about $14,000 per household. And so much of my life is staying loyal to the urgencies that I see every day in communities like Newark and other places. We were innovators when I was mayor, everything from the criminal justice system, from youth courts, veteran courts, to all the way to reentry. We were innovators on finding ways to deal with a lot of problems in one way. And we found that the earth was a great way to do it. We actually created reentry programs, putting people to work on, we converted city block or plus, like large swaths of city land into urban farms, which now you have people who are employed, you're producing food on food deserts. We had educational programs for our kids. They became community repair points. In other words, restitching the fabric of our communities, watching elders and young people all working together to grow this bounty for our community, which actually helped to affect public safety in those areas. So it's amazing how our planet wants to heal, our communities want to heal. We've been over-reliant on police and jails and prisons, which have continued to wound and harm communities because of the economic devastation that goes when kids in college smoking marijuana don't get arrested or doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing, and their economic chances are ground down. So I like this idea of allowing local leaders, that the federal government provides incentives and resources and funding to allow local leaders to bring local solutions to scale in communities that end up creating just interconnected, healthier ecosystems, both spiritually, economically, public safety-wise, medical-wise, and so much more. And by the way, I love the fact that it would transform policing in America. And actually, the law enforcement officers I had the privilege of working with, so many of them would be thrilled that suddenly we are a nation that is dealing with mental health through diet, through access to health care, through nurturing environments that deal with trauma the appropriate way, and more. And so these are the kind of conversations we need to be having. The one thing I'll say in the end of that question is what I found as mayor, and I used to say this all the time, there's not a problem in America where someone has not found out in America how to solve that problem. We just haven't brought things to scale. I used to tell my team all the time, good mayors borrow, great mayors steal. Find me the best ideas out there, and let's bring them to Newark and plant them in our soil. And so there are pilot programs everywhere. And I'll give you just one great example. When I was a mayor, I discovered this incredible place in Seattle called Plymouth Housing. And they simply did a study, what was cheaper for Seattle, Washington, to allow beautiful Americans with mental illness to be homeless on the streets, or to put them in supportive housing. And as you probably know, supportive housing is expensive. It's not only building the housing, but having the resources there to support the people that live there, whether it's people dealing with HIV, people dealing with mental health issues, or elderly. And they found out it was significantly cheaper to put people in supportive housing, because when you leave people, your brothers and sisters, in the streets, homeless with mental illness, they end up in expensive places, hospital emergency rooms, and police engaged, dealing with them in jails. It's wildly expensive. It does not elevate human potential, human flourishing. It assaults human dignity, when we could be a country that does things better, that makes us safer, elevates human potential, because they found out that people were getting back into the workforce as well when they had supportive housing. So all of our goals can be achieved when our policies reflect our values. What does love look like? As one great writer said, what does love look like in public? It looks like justice. And that's what we need to be doing with a more holistic approach to our country's challenges.
Of course, we're in a moment right now where the federal government is spending a lot of money on stimulus, on responding to COVID-19 and the economic fallout. Is there room to use some of this funding for climate and perhaps other things? What are other priorities you'd like to see?
Well, so the answer is yes, but the problem we have is, again, we have certain leaders in Washington that are out of step with even the people they claim to represent. And so this climate is not a priority. We have on our federal level, because this is not true of local Republicans, but on the federal level, we're the one major political party on the planet Earth that denies even the climate crisis, is the federal Republican Party. And so it's very hard to deal with a problem if you won't even name it. And it's very hard to institute resources. I can tell you programs that would save, for every dollar you invest, $5 of taxpayer money. But because they're not a priority, we're not willing to make the investment. But we would much rather pay on the back end in diabetes or hypertension. We'd much rather pay on the back end in prisons. All the things when we don't solve problems that we have to do in our emergency rooms, in our prisons, in our jails. It's just a failure as a society to be visionary on the front end. And so this is why electoral politics right now is more crucial than I've ever seen it, because I think the American people are getting way ahead. I mean, you have Mississippi changing its flag, but I still have the United States senators resisting and fighting the taking down of Confederate statues in the Capitol. This is a moment where I hope this election marks the end of this kind of politics, where we start seeing an alignment. And I think that this could be, I'm very hopeful if this kind of activism turns into high levels of voter turnout, which people are focused on their issues and not personalities. Then I think we can actually get a lot of change, not just in this election, but by demanding it in the days and months afterwards.
Right. Well, I think just one last question to end on here, and this has come up several times throughout the course of the discussion in different ways, which is voting. And I know you've worked a lot on the Voting Rights Act, on a reform to the Voting Rights Act. Can you just talk about, what needs to be done to protect our elections, in the fall?
I mean, what needs to be done, period, are things like, let's get out of having a voting moment and having a voting period. Let's have automatic voter registration. Let's expand the franchise in this country so that, you not only want automatic voter registration, but same day voting. There's so many things we can do that would get more people participating in our system and more safely. Now, that's in general. I can go through a lot of principles, but right now, we're about less than 120 days, if my math is correct, before a major election. And you have some states that are struggling to get ready for possibly voting during a pandemic, and other states, and leaders rhetorically saying outrageous things that make people less confident in voting, or online voting, or creating environments where people have to choose between their health and safety. They might have an underlying condition, or their franchise, which is outrageous. And so there's a lot of work from Stacey Abrams' organization, Fair Fight, that is working to try to fight these battles in courts all across our country right now. to other great lawyers I know that are working on voting rights. And I'm sorry that we are in this world now where it's strange, where everything from voting, which would be a universally supported thing, to wearing a mask, which is just science, are becoming politicized in our country, when the very values of our democracy and very ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness necessitate us coming together and thinking constructively. Look, I love rugged individualism. I love the ideals of self-reliance, but rugged individualism and self-reliance didn't get us to the moon, didn't beat the Nazis. We did these things by finding ways to work together and finding common cause. We are failing to see the common cause that we have and the urgencies amongst us, and our very democracy is holding in the balance now. So what I tell my friends is there are going to be voting challenges, but there were voting challenges in the 1960s as well, when Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner died trying to register people to vote, when people in the Edmund Pettus Bridge were beaten viciously trying to win a greater franchise. We've got to show that same level of courage and determination as our ancestors did, despite the obstacles, to make this one of the highest voter turnout elections ever. If we do that, I'm actually pretty confident that in the aftermath, if we're willing to do the work in the aftermath, that we can change our nation and advance us towards our common principles and ideals, and hopefully get into the foothills of the great mountain top that King talked about us getting to being a more beloved nation, where we not only care about each other with our words, but our reality reflects that as well.
Senator Booker, thank you so much for taking the time. It's great to talk.
No, I'm so grateful. Thank you. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.